Thank you, John. I've just got a couple of questions to Ambassador Sibal. But first of all, I wanted to say I found it absolutely fascinating. We've been talking about, for the last 3 days, about a dichotomized world and the way we're putting bits of it together again in new and interesting ways, rather than the stagnant postures of the non-aligned movement versus the others. The question, I was quite interested to know, Ambassador, do you have any figures on the balance of trade between Africa and India? Are there any global figures or do you have any sort of, obviously not separate countries, but the continent as a whole? And also on Indian foreign direct investment in Africa. And the second question was simply on Afghanistan. To what extent is India prepared to protect its investments, its increasing investments and interests in Afghanistan? And would that protection actually reignite Pakistan-Indian hostility? Thank you.
Thank you. Fernando Lima from Mozambique.
Thank you very much, John. I'm enjoying it. This is my first time in such a gathering, and I'm enjoying all the debates here. And on this particular debate, first of all, I would like to recognize the importance of India and South Africa in helping security along the Indian Ocean and Channel of Mozambique, in protecting economic resources there, and also the issues of piracy and so. I would also recognize that it's important for countries like Mozambique and other countries in Southern Africa to have access to finances and the financial systems of India and China. And this gives to countries like ours an alternative to go to get credit lines from Washington or European Union. But, and there is always a questioning on those things, and as brilliant Assistant Secretary General of UN from Guinea-Bissau have said a couple of years ago, are the whales from the north different from the whales from the south? And his questioning was more or less to say that the whales were similar. And so the question is, should we be more happy to have our resources being explored by companies like Jindal, SR, Mittal? What's the difference between US Anadarko and Oil India or Oil China? So the point is to raise the issue of the quality of such cooperation, and also the issue of, are we missing here something that came from the past? Someone would call it Cold War, or the heritage of non-aligned, meaning the element of ideology, the element of solidarity. And this is missing because when we see this South-South cooperation having the same elements that we don't like labor issues, environment issues, land grabbing issues, such issues that shocked, for example, President Lula da Silva from Brazil when he visited Mozambique and took knowledge of what Vale is doing in exploring coal in Mozambique. Thank you.
Thank you. William Chung from Singapore.
Thank you, John. My first question is to Ambassador Sibal. If I read you correctly, you said that India's biggest economic partner is the US, its biggest trade partner in goods is China, and its security cooperation partner is Russia. And then you went on to say that ASEAN wants greater Indian involvement in ASEAN to balance China. Now, my question is that notion of ASEAN getting India to balance China simply a geopolitical wet dream? I mean, is that possible, if at all? My second question is Professor Steinberg. You talked a lot about ASEAN and how effective ASEAN is. I remember speaking to a senior ASEAN official, whom I should not name, and he talked about, ASEAN is always in the driver's seat of Asia-Pacific affairs. It's just that the person in the driver's seat does not know where it's going. So maybe I want to ask you, how coherent or effective do you think ASEAN is, given that ASEAN is increasingly challenged by China on the South China Sea issue, and individual ASEAN members see themselves actually having to make kind of choices between the US and China? Thank you.
Mr. Barun.
Thank you. I have two questions for each of the speakers. Mr. Sibal, you've spoken about the importance of trade in various South regions, including the GCC. And we can also see that India is being very active in projecting its naval power, either in the GCC or in the Arabian Sea or in Horn of Africa. And talking about merchants being followed by crusaders, does this cause any sort of conflicting feelings about whether this is a source of relief or a source of worry to your partners? Second question to Mr. Steinberg. You're talking to regional organizations, and you find this quite helpful, but does that undermine international organizations such as the UN? Thank you.
Thank you. Katrina Enberg.
Thank you. I think it is correct to look at some of these drivers for cooperation as part of a larger picture that Steinberg was alluding to, that can be described as the growing importance of regional organizations as security providers in general, and that the hybrid system of cooperation between these regional organizations is a stabilizing, an important one in the security area. It would, for example, have been almost impossible for the European Union to carry out its light interventions that was mentioned previously during this conference without the condonement of the African Union or some of the sub-regional organizations in Africa. Similarly, it would have been almost impossible for former European colonial powers to be part and lead some of these operations without being folded into the regional organization of the European Union. So this interaction between the regional organizations in the area of security is a very interesting one, and as I said before, a stabilizing one in the area of security policy.
Thank you. Renato Flores.
Thank you, John. Well, I heard a lot of descriptions, many very interesting, a few distorted, but I'm afraid I heard nothing about metrics, and the title of the session is Measuring South-South Strategic Networks. So allow me to suggest two measures to be discussed by the panel. The first one, I think, is the capacity of rule-making of these networks. If we take this gentle kind of war called trade, and trade is war actually, we know that nowadays trade is a war of norms, standards, specifications for products, commodities, logistics, and food. And the capacity of the South-South networks in rule-making in this area is extremely limited, I would say non-existent. All the rules and norms are made by the established powers particularly the European Union and the US. So I think this is an interesting measure, an interesting metric to be used. A second one is the statistics of the instances in which the established powers blocked a successful initiative by South-South cooperation. The Brazil-Turkey initiative regarding Iran was mentioned, and I think that it's a very interesting example because the two countries were at first allowed to pursue the effort because nobody believed that they would be successful. When they revealed themselves to be successful and they fixed an agreement with Iran, they were jeopardized by the established powers. So this is my modest contribution to the plenary session. Thank you.
Thank you, Renato. Philip Stevens.
Thank you. I just wanted to take up and ask Jim Steinberg a question about his very elegant exposition as to how the end of colonization, then the end of the Cold War, and now globalization has robbed South-South networks of the sort of glue that might have bound them together and led to this more hybrid system. It seems to me the one thing he didn't mention, which is still a glue for the South, is the belief in state sovereignty and in non-interference. And if you like, if you're looking for a theology of the South, that seems to be it. Now, if we are seeing this new fragmented world in which you have overlapping hybrid organizations between the advanced nations and the rising states in different forms and formats and constellations, does this assume that the advanced nations have given up on multilateralism in its old form? Have we now given up on the idea that we can have global systems of rules and just accepted, as we seem to have done in the WTO, that isn't going to work anymore, so we just have to accept that it's going to be much more complex, much more hybrid, much more regional?
Dana Allen.
Well, my question is very similar to Philip Stevens, but I'll ask it anyway. It's inspired by the last part of your remarks, Jim. You know, since we're preoccupied again with a vicious civil war, questions of intervention, responsibility to protect, it is striking, and I think this is what Philip was saying, that it's just a few Western countries, mainly the United States, France, and Britain, that seem to share singular attitudes in distinction to the rest of the world, even if they're a bit weary right now. And so my question, which is slightly different than Philip's, is do you expect ever to see any kind of convergence of North-South attitudes on these issues? Or conversely, I mean, you intimated that Cold War-style constellations are over, but do countries like Russia have something to play for here in a leadership sense?
Igor Jürgens.
My question is from the biggest defense partner of India. I can announce that in a week's time, after 10 years of preparation, the aircraft carrier will be delivered to you, finally. But the question is, do you feel the jealousy from Russia in this triangle, Russia, China, India, when we talk about the Central Asia? Because you keep talking about the north-south corridor and using Turkmenistan gas, Kazakhstan gas and oil and all of that stuff. And that would make Mr. Putin unhappy.
I'm going to disappoint a few people, Sanjaya, Francois, a few others, because I think we probably have enough ammunition for our two speakers to respond to. So could I give you each 3 minutes or so in Ambassador first, and then Jim Steinberg, and then we'll close with that. Thank you.
Thank you. Is this on?
It's on.
Yeah. Well, the balance of trade is in Africa's favor, but the figures I don't have. FDI figures I don't have, but I gave some indication of the kind of investments that we are making in Africa. But our focus is essentially on capacity building in Africa, and we've been rather successful there. A lot of the bureaucrats, civil servants, others are being trained either in India or locally. So a lot of concentration on the human element. Insofar as Afghanistan is concerned, we are committed to about $4 to $5 billion of eventual investment in the iron ore sector in Afghanistan. The government of Afghanistan has offered us an economic corridor, resource corridor in Afghanistan, which, if we were to invest in, would mean huge sums. But all this is contingent on stability in Afghanistan. We have actually profited a great deal from the security that has been provided by US and NATO in Afghanistan. And under cover of that, we've been able to establish our presence there. Now, with the US-NATO withdrawal, the situation becomes very different. Karzai has been pressing us to step into the breach, and even has been asking us to give some military aid, equipment, and this and that. But we're very cautious about it. I don't think we're going to go down this road because that'll be a thin end of the wedge, and we'll get more and more involved. So it's a very difficult situation for us, and I don't think, other than trying to develop an alternative route to Afghanistan through Iran, and that project is now developing reasonably well, and hoping that some kind of quasi-stability would be possible in Afghanistan, which would allow us to continue our economic efforts on the ground. But if the situation really deteriorates badly, and there is a kind of a civil war situation, then I think all our plans would end up in cold storage. Insofar as exploration of resources by Indian companies in Africa, etc., is concerned, there's a big difference between what we are doing and what, for example, China is doing. Our private sector is going into Africa entirely on its own, They have to do their sums, they have to see their bottom lines, they have to see if the investment is profitable or not profitable. There's no grand design. In fact, that is the reason why we've not been able to establish our presence in Africa in a way that we would secure for ourselves stable access to its resources, because if tomorrow these companies feel that it's no longer possible for them to economically continue their investment, they'll simply withdraw. And government is not going to come in and bail them out or support them. So in that sense, I think the thing that you might have in mind about Indian private sector exploiting the resources of Africa, as some other countries are doing, to my mind, is not a fear that is well-founded. Insofar as ASEAN is concerned, all I can recall, I didn't quite understand, didn't quite catch what the comment was, but I recall what Lee Kuan Yew himself had said, that ASEAN is a jumbo plane and one wing is China and the other wing is India. So if the intention was that without the wings being reasonably balanced, the plane cannot fly, then I think that there is some kind of a balance that at least Singapore had in mind in inviting India to be proactive in ASEAN. But I would agree that China is far ahead, and it's not a question of developing an equal balance with them, but I think India's increasing presence in ASEAN, apart from the fact that it provides access to the Indian market, and India also gets access to the rising market in Southeast Asia, does provide a political balance within ASEAN and within the organizations that have been set up within ASEAN, whether it's the RSCP or the East Asia Summit. Insofar as India's naval power is concerned, I don't think we are at all wishing to exert any kind of naval pressure on the little countries, especially to the west of us. It is more a question of the fact that we have geographically a dominant position in this region, and we have certain concerns about the potential rivalries that could emerge in this region with the strengthening of the military capabilities of China. And therefore, the strategic advantage we have of geography and the fact that we have a strong Navy and which is expanding would consolidate our geostrategic advantage in this region, which we want to be able to do so. And this would be in consultation and in harmony with certainly the littoral states. And the fact is that the GCC countries have been open to the idea of a greater role for the Indian Navy in providing security to them. In fact, we are hesitant. We are hesitant in going too far ahead. We had an agreement with Qatar and the UAE, but we are reticent because we don't want to get involved in the conflicts in this area. Insofar as the comment about capacity for rulemaking is concerned, I would agree that it is limited, though of course the fact that the WTO has not been able to achieve results and the climate change negotiations are also very complicated and difficult. It is because of the stand that is being taken by the southern countries, if you wish. So while it may not be possible for them to define the new rules, they are in a position to resist the imposition of rules which don't suit them. To that extent, they are being more effective on the ground. India has no experience of the established powers blocking South-South initiatives of the kind that we have been involved in. And finally, with regard to two things, Central Asia and President Putin's presumed unhappiness with the flow of energy from Central Asia to South Asia. I know for a fact that when the United States promoted the idea of linking Central Asian resources to South Asia, the Russians were very unhappy, and we had to be very careful in wanting to go along with this idea, but in consultation with Russia. And our impression is that the Russians' position, our impression, rightly or wrongly, is that Russian position has evolved a great deal. And in fact, even with regard to TAPI or earlier the India-Pakistan-Iran pipeline, the Russians were more interested in getting contracts for laying the pipelines rather than opposing these projects. And finally, on the issue of convergence of North-South on issues of military intervention, I'm afraid that's going to be a long haul, and I can't see easily the southern countries agreeing to such a military intervention outside the approval of the UN Security Council.
Thank you very much. Jim Steinberg. Excellent. Thank you. That was brilliant.
So great comments, and I'll try to just make 4 quick points. I have a slightly different, perhaps, perspective on this last point. I actually see this in a glass half full perspective, and I'm struck how far many of the countries in the so-called South have come to supporting the idea of intervention. It's most dramatic in the case of Africa and the African Union, where we're seeing now very significant number of cases where African countries are intervening in internal problems of their neighbors. We've seen this in the Congo and in Cote d'Ivoire and Somalia and the like, and sometimes with the UN support, sometimes not. And even in the case of Libya, where there were disagreements among African countries about that, a number of African countries were very supportive of the intervention. So I actually do see an evolution. And we also see this in the Arab world. It's obviously very contextual, but Dana, it's not just the United States and France and the UK. It's Turkey and Saudi Arabia and the UAE and Qatar who are in favor of intervention. And so I actually see much greater activism and much more sort of case-by-case decision-making on this rather than ideology. I mean, there are still many who disagree, but I think when the circumstances are right, that the practical considerations are overriding this traditional kind of all-or-nothing view about sovereignty. Which leads me to my point about the regional and global organizations. A number of you raised this. I'd make 3 points. I mean, one, obviously, is the collective action problem. The larger the N, the more countries involved, the harder it is to get decisions. And so there is a temptation to take it to smaller forum. But second, there's also a kind of a building up set of strategies. If we can reach agreements on a regional level and then take them to the global level, that has some attractions. And we've seen that at least in some cases on trade. Back when I was involved in the Clinton administration on the ITA agreement, which came out of APEC and then became globalized, is a good example of laying the groundwork through regional organizations and then making it universal. And then finally, of course, is the UN Charter from the beginning has recognized the importance of regional organizations as a tool for dealing with some of these problems. So there are tensions, I agree. I don't want to completely sweep them under the rug, but I also think that they aren't inherently in conflict. Katrina Engberg's point, I think, was extremely important and brought out something I should have said something about, which is one of the attractions of regional organizations is not only their greater capacity to deal with the problems and their greater knowledge and kind of nuanced understanding of the problems, but also the legitimacy point. And I think that that's one of the reasons why these hybrid efforts are so important. It's much easier for the United States or the United States and Europe and others to justify involvement if they have the support of the regional organizations. And I think these hybrid interventions have been most successful, not just because of the physical capacity that regional organizations can bring, but because of their political legitimacy, particularly when it's not possible to get the support of the Security Council. Which leads me to this last very important point about the South China Sea and ASEAN, and goes to Mr. Flores' point about metric, because actually this is going to be a very important test of the efficacy of ASEAN. I think it's been non-trivial in terms of how ASEAN, in its engagement, frankly, with China over the declaration of conduct and the potential code of conduct for the South China Sea, has demonstrated that when it holds together, or at least everybody except Cambodia, that they actually put a lot of pressure on China to come to the table. But the real test and the real metric in this case, I think, will be whether China is successful in trying to bilateralize and marginalize other countries, or whether ASEAN will be sufficiently united to say we need China to take these concerns seriously, even though each of us have different specific claims, that ASEAN as a whole has a strong interest in some rules-based understandings about activities in the South China Sea. And I think if ASEAN can hold together, China will have to take it seriously, and I think that could lead to a very significant outcome in terms of what kind of metric we want to measure for South-South cooperation.
Well, Ambassador Jim, thank you very much. That really was an excellent session and added the nuance to the general theme that we had put before you. I think now we have both a better understanding of what South-South networks might be, how we might measure them, and also in particular an appreciation that neither in the South nor in the North is there a sense that these networks should stay within a particular geography, and indeed we would arrive at a better state of international security and concord if there was a proliferation of these hybrid arrangements. So perhaps that is an interesting way penultimately to conclude our discussions here, but I say penultimately because in 3 minutes we'll begin the final plenary session. In the last couple of years, people power has been one of the phrases that has described international affairs and the impetus for change in domestic and international systems. And our final plenary session is on political activism and its geopolitical effects, chaired by Francois Hesbourg, with a series of really very bright ISS-related analysts. So I do hope that you shift in your seats but not move from them as we draw this GSR to its conclusion with our 6th plenary session. Thank you very much to both our speakers. Thanks.